That's what some people call the Three Sisters system. We should call it the Two Sisters because we only use two in this setup. What does that mean? So essentially there are three plants that apparently in South America and Central America are usually interplanted. Not very consciously actually. I think in South America and in Central America people interplant everything like in most indigenous cultures, and use the space very differently than what we do in Western agriculture. Anyway, this is something that struck the Westerners that saw their gardens, and so it's been called the Three Sisters. And one of the sisters is the squash, winter squash, and the other one is sweet corn, maize, and the third potential one is French beans that climb up the sweet corn. Now in this country you have to be careful if you do this system, because some people transplant them all at the same time and it goes horribly wrong, because the beans start climbing up the sweet corn when it's still that high, and therefore it gets it doesn't grow because it gets pulled down. So what we do to avoid that problem is we plant only two sisters, that is squash and sweet corn. And look at this squash, it was trailing on the ground but now it's climbing up the sweet corn, so we have to make sure that it doesn't break it. I'll go in there and tidy up. But look at the bountifulness of this. This squash is really healthy and it's already producing some beautiful fruit in there. Let me show you. So there's one. This is an ancient South American variety called Ute, and this is Uchikikuri, a Japanese variety that keeps really well and it's very tasty. And yeah, so if you want to add the third sister, which is the beans, you could do it now for a very late harvest of French beans. We don't do that, we just do the two, and look at how well it works, because the sweet corn doesn't need the space on the ground, it likes to grow up. And on the other hand, the squash doesn't need the vertical space and it likes to grow out, and it suppresses all the weeds. Also gives a bit of protection from the wind. And if you had the beans would be fixing nitrogen, so providing extra food to the whole lot. Let me see if there are more squash. These are a bit smaller here, but they're very abundant from one plant. And yes, so essentially what's the tip to take home from this? Next year in May, when you transplant your courgettes and your squash, winter squash can go with sweet corn to make best use of the space. Later on, like in early July, perhaps depending on the year, or late July, or even very early August, you can transplant some beans to let them climb up the sweet corn, but not earlier. I wouldn't go any earlier than the mid part of July, the second half of July at best. Okay, another question that sometimes may come up is how to tell whether your pumpkins or squash are ready to harvest. And now there's a very easy thing you can check, and it's the state of the connection between the plant, the stem, and the fruit. So if this one is still soft and not dry, and you can tell because the color is still kind of orangey, and it's, if I put my fingernail into it, it will sink into it. Or if it's dry. Now this is going more towards the dry side, but it's got a bit of time to go yet still. And then you can see some that are clearly a lot more dry, like this guy here, if you compare it to the previous one, which was orange. Still somewhat soft, but it's really getting drier and drier. And you can tell there as well, all that woody stuff, there's still some green, so this one isn't ready yet. Most of squash won't be ready yet, but you can see the progression towards woodier and woodier pedicel, woodier and woodier connection to the stem. And I'll show you in a couple of weeks when they're really, really ready. But two things to notice here is that powdery mildew at this stage will attack the older leaves, and the whole plant will die. The whole foliage of the plant will die, and that's completely fine because the energy is being put into the fruit. The plant knows that in this phase what's important is to give the seeds all the energy they need. So all the energy will go into the fruit and into the seeds, and the foliage gets sacrificed. And because it doesn't get so much nutrition anymore from the plant, it's more vulnerable to fungal attacks, and that's completely fine. So you'll see this beautiful lush foliage that you remember from a few weeks ago has now become sad, and it will become sadder and sadder until it all shrivels and dries. And most of the squash plants leaves are water, so these things will disappear into the ground without you needing to do much. You can bring them into the compost if you want to. There's no need to, because they will literally disappear into the ground because there's a little bit of fibre, but most of the tissue is really full of water, and it will evaporate or go down into the... Okay, with the background of the goldfinches, which were right next to me in the field a moment ago, but I couldn't catch them on video. I want to do an update on squash. So how do you know when your squash is ready? I've already done a video on that. Go and look up in the channel. But I wanted to show you this. So essentially now all the foliage is going to die off, and the different types of squash will emerge. And then you can do what I've suggested in the previous video, which is check whether this part where the fruit is connected to the stem, look at that bee, still trying to pollinate, is dry. So this is clearly green and soft, so it still needs to go a little bit longer. And we have different varieties. If you know uchikikuri or Japanese Hokkaido squashes, they're really, really sweet, really nice, very hard skin. They store really well, and they're relatively early as a squash. This is a type of butternut that makes a funny pumpkin-like shape. Here you see that it's starting to dry up. And then we have ute, U-T-E, one of the best tasting squash in the world, a very ancient variety from the South American continent. And you can see that the foliage is dying. Don't worry about that. That's just a sign that the plant is putting all the energy into the fruit. And when the entire plant will be dead, you keep looking at that part there, and when it's completely dry, you're ready to harvest it. But just to give you a feel for, in the southwest, in Devon at the moment, that's the situation. These are late butternut squashes. The early uchikikuri, they look more like this. So don't panic, and look at the abundance. This is a part of the garden. This is not inside the garden, actually. It's a new area that we wanted to clear for the long term. And so essentially we've just put squash because they cover the ground, suppress weeds, and also they can do whatever they want out here, and they produce really, really well. Here's a tip for you when you're going to remove your squash. We've already discussed this in previous videos on this channel. You should make sure that this part is dry. Now, if you scratch it with your finger, you'll see if it comes off soft and green. This is still a bit soft and still not completely ready. Now, this type of squash here tends to ripen very late, but then it's easy to distinguish when it's dry or not. So this is already drying quite a lot because it's very hard, and it's not, even though it looks green, it looks quite woody. So it's about ready. It's nearly ready to be picked. Now, if you're unsure and you don't want to risk it, two things. So first of all, why would you need this to be dry? Because if it's still wet and soft, it means that there is a hole in this at the center of this connection here, and that's the hole through which the plant sends sugars into the fruit. That's why these leaves are dying off. It's because all the sugars and all the nutrients from these leaves are going into the fruit and into the seeds inside this fruit. Now, if you cut it too early, like for example at the stage where this guy is, what happens is you'll find a massive hole in the middle there, and that hole is where fungi and rot can get in. There is still a way to avoid that, even though you're unsure whether your pumpkin is ready or not, your squash is ready or not. And it's to cut, rather than cut through here, is to cut here and there. So that you cut in an area which is not necessarily directly connected to your pumpkin, and which will dry a lot faster. Then you can let your squash cure in the sun. So first of all, let me show you what I mean. You'd pick it like that. Okay, so you cut here, you cut there, so that this peduncle, this area here, this connection is not open, it's not cut open. And then you would cure this in the sun, in a covered space, obviously, frost-free, possibly in a polytunnel or greenhouse, for as long as it's needed for this to look very, very, very dry. And then you store it over winter and up to a year, even more than a year in some cases, in a warm temperature, at a warm temperature. So that would be a house, somewhere where the temperature is higher than 15 degrees. So to recap, try and cut your pumpkin when this is quite dry and it looks very, very woody. Let me give you an example. For example, this one is already a lot better. You can see it looks very woody. This guy here, It looks woody, even though it's not ready yet, but it's getting there. And second thing is, when you harvest it, cut here and there rather than cutting across here. And third thing is, store it, leave it in the sun to cure, to make its skin very hard and impervious to fungi for at least a week, if not two, in the hottest area you have outside. And then bring it inside and store it always above 12-15 degrees to avoid it rotting. Talking of squashes, we've got several varieties here that you might consider for next year. This is called Ute Indian. You can find it from Real Seeds. It's an open pollinated one. It's supposed to be one of the best tasting squash in the world. We can't confirm that yet because we haven't tried any. This is one of my favorite, actually my very favorite squash. It's called Autumn Crown. Unfortunately, it's a hybrid, Autumn Crown F1, but it's beautiful because it's like a butternut squash that looks like a pumpkin. I love that. And then we've got Uchiki Kuri. That's a smallish one actually, but very, very early one. Very hard, very well stored, very good at storing, and yeah, very good taste. Very hard to cut though, because it's got very thick skin, which makes it a good storer. This one, a commercial variety called Kabucha F1. This is a hybrid again, whereas that one was an open pollinated seed. Very, very, very good taste and incredible texture. So the flesh holds well and it roasts well. It stays quite firm. And we don't have any more here actually. It's finally that time of the year. The sun is low in the sky, even in the morning. Roger looking in between the squashes, and we're harvesting our beautiful Autumn Crown squash. This is a type of butternut squash, a Moscata variety, which has got the shape of a baby pumpkin. So there is a trick there to make sure that they store well. I mean, these type of squashes, the butternut family, won't store incredibly well for more than 6 months, but you can still make sure that they store as better as you can let them. So whenever you have that, rather than cutting across there, it's better to cut all around. It's difficult with one hand. There you go. So hopefully with sharp secateurs. There you go. So by doing that, you let this part of the plant heal and seal, so that the rot cannot get in. No fungi can get in, and so later on you can make another cut there when the squash has been cured. Now it will be cured in the sun in the polytunnel for up to a week, and then it will go in a warm place above 10 degrees, above 15 preferably, but below 25, and then they can store at those temperatures for up to 6 months in this case, but other squashes will store more than a year, depending on the variety.